Today we're going to continue with our discussion of Python. So just as a reminder, this is not meant to replace a true programming course on Python, but to jog your memory in case you've forgotten some of the basics of Python, or you need to translate what you know from another language into Python. So let's continue our discussion today by talking about data types that you may encounter in Python. So Python, as a programming language, needs to store information. This information is stored in variables, and those variables each have a data type. The rules for interacting between various data types are strict, and you can get confused if you don't know how to use these data types properly. And Python is a little bit different from other programming languages in the way that it uses particular data types. Some data types are very similar to other programming languages like integers and floats. There won't be too much different from what you know compared to C or JavaScript or things like that. But when we start talking about strings and lists, things will be a little bit different. So let's first talk about integers and floats. Integers are natural numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. There are two different ways that you can do division in Python. One is called integer division, symbolized by the double /. And when you take two integers and divide them into each other, with integer division, you will get an integer as a result. On the other hand, if you use a single / and you take two integers as input, you will then get a float as a result. Note that if you had typed in instead 22.0, then those are immediately floats, and there would be no way of doing integer division. In addition to division, another operator that you should remember is the modulo division, which is just a %, and this gives you the remainder when you do integer division, in which case this would be 1 had you done 22 mod 7. A data type that we're going to be working with a lot are strings, and Python has a lot of handy built-in functions for working with strings in a simple way. Strings are usually set off by quote marks. These can be either double quote marks or single quote marks. Both of them define a string. One of the very nice functions built into Python is a strip function, which removes any of the white space, such as the space at the beginning or the end of the string here. When you call the strip function, you then get a string without any of those white spaces at the beginning or the end. You can also search for substrings inside a longer string. So for example, if you search for the substring am, within the string s, it will tell you that it's in the third position of the string. So here is the string am, here is position 0, here is position 1, here is position 2, and am starts in position 3 of the substring. There are lots of other string functions that Python gives you for free. Another example of that is the replace function, where you can take a substring, and every time that it sees this substring, it will replace it by this other substring, and then return the result. Moving on from strings, let's now talk about lists. Lists are very similar to strings. Both are ordered collections of data, and you can access individual elements within them using square brackets. Let's now move on to a different data type, the list data type. Lists are very similar to strings. In both cases, they're ordered collections of data. A list, however, is more specific in that the collection of data in a string has only characters as constituent elements. A list, on the other hand, can be anything at all. But in both cases, you can get to individual elements of either a list or a string by using the square bracket operator. A common way of creating lists is using the range operator. The range operator takes a single argument, an integer, and then returns all of the integers less than that integer. So if you put in range 10, you get 0 all the way up to 9. Then if you want to access an element inside this new list that we've created called L, you can use the square bracket operator. And if you put in the argument 4, you get back 4, because 4 is the fourth element of the list. But remember, because we're in Python, the list is indexed starting from 0. So if you use 0 as your operator argument, you get 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, on up to 4. To show the equivalence between lists and strings, we can turn a string into a list. If we do that, recall that S is the string that we had on the previous slide. I am the very model of a modern Major General. If you then turn that into a list, you get each of the characters as an individual element inside the list. But that's not a very natural way of splitting a string into a list, and thankfully Python has a handy function called split that looks for a particular character that you provided as an argument, and then splits the string whenever it sees that. So if you put in a basic space, you get, as a result, a list of all of the strings separated by white space in the original string S. And this roughly corresponds to words. But not all of them are really words. So for example, you have these empty strings here. We'll try to get rid of that in a second. But first, let's now ask some questions of this new list that we've created. And so if you ask for individual words inside that string, it will tell you true or false, whether or not it's in that list. True and false are examples of an additional data type that we haven't talked about yet. That data type is a Boolean data type. We'll talk more about this when we start talking about loops and conditionals. So now let's say that we want to get rid of all of the empty characters inside that list. We can do something called a list comprehension or a filter function to get rid of that. And so the filter function takes as an argument a little function called a lambda function. And this lambda function returns true whenever your list element is not equal to the empty string. And then we apply it to the same thing that we had up here. So when we do that, we now get all of the words in the string that are not the empty string. We'll see more about these list comprehensions in a little bit. One of the most exciting things about Python, and the reason why I fell in love with Python when I first started using it, is that it also has a dictionary data type. The dictionary data type is very useful. It is a mapping from keys to values. So we begin with an empty dictionary, and a dictionary uses curly brackets to create itself. Recall that a list uses the square brackets when you create an empty list. Okay, so we now have an empty dictionary, and we're going to say that whenever you ask me for the key of 3, I will give you the value of 4. So we have now stored 4 inside the key address of 3. And so if you ask the dictionary to return what is at key 3, it will give you 4. If you ask it for a key that it hasn't seen before, it will give you an error. It will give you a key error saying, I don't know about this key that you're calling 2. The other important thing to remember about dictionaries is that dictionaries can only have one value for every key. And so if you reuse the key 3, you will replace whatever was in that key with a new value, in this case 2. So if you asked for it before, it would return 4. But now that you're asking for what is at key 3, you get the value of 2. One of the lovely things about Python is that you can use just about any data type for a key. However, one data type that you cannot use is a list. You cannot use a list as a key, but you can use a list as a value. So you can store a list as a value and address it with a string or an integer or something like that. Okay, so that's a very, very brief introduction to Python data types and how to access them. We're going to be talking more about each of these data types, and we'll talk about ways of accessing these data types as needed throughout the course, but this should hopefully give you a flavor of what's going on when I start showing example programs. However, the next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be more about how to put these pieces together. We're going to be talking about functions and classes and how to create larger programs.